was where prostitutes hung out, he was accidentally mistaken as one.
It just totally surprised me, and it made me mad because I'd gone there to talk to God, and here I am in the midst of male prostitutes and people thinking I'm one.
David prostituted himself that night for the first time, and he vowed it would be the last. Instead, it just caused a craving for more.
For a kid who's always wanted an older man to hold them and to tell them they were wonderful and that they were okay, it was instantly addicting to me.
After college, David concealed his life as a prostitute and went to Hollywood to pursue his dream to act. Unlike most aspiring actors, David's career quickly blossomed.
In fact, the first part I ever read for I got, and it was the starring role in a movie. So I had one of those experiences you only read about. I ended up with the best agents in town, a string of national commercials, another starring role, several feature roles, and being written up in the magazines about, and yet I would continue to be a male prostitute on the side. So I was like trying to destroy whatever success I was seeking. There was so much self-hatred in me.
After several years in Hollywood, David's double life took its toll. He longed for spiritual fulfillment, so he searched to find God. Unfortunately, he was misled by a friend into a cult. But during this time, something very interesting happened in David's parents' life.
In the meantime, my parents had gotten born again. My dad, my cold, severe dad, Scottish dad, had gotten born again at a charismatic convention of Presbyterians. So I started getting into my head that I had to go to Israel to find Jesus, because I was starting to doubt some of the things the guru was saying.
David went to Israel and discovered things about Christ he never realized, especially Christ's love for him.
I'm walking down the Mount of Olives the last day I'm in Israel, tagging along behind this Christian tour group, getting myself a free tour. And when the pastor leading the tour group would read from the Bible things Jesus said at various points on the Mount of Olives, I heard Jesus saying them to me. I instantly knew the Bible was literally the Word of God. I went into the Garden of Gethsemane and I knelt at that rock, the very rock that Christ knelt at, and I prayed and I said, God, my guru can do miracles and you can do miracles, and how am I supposed to know the difference? Who's of God and who's of Satan? And he said to me, who proved his love for you? And, well, Jesus, obviously, he died on the cross. There's the answer.
David dedicated his life to Christ that day, and his life dramatically changed. David went back to Los Angeles, left the cult, and found a church home. His life grew spiritually, and through prayer, David was delivered from homosexuality. But David's complete deliverance came after he paid a surprise visit to his father's church.
I was so transformed in my countenance, he didn't even recognize me. And he goes, oh, whoa, what has happened to you? And I said, Dad, I'm born again. It's the first time I'd seen my dad weep. And we hugged.
David and his father reconciled. Even though his father never lived to see it, David fulfilled his father's dream.
He'd always wanted to have a son go to seminary. And he had 4 boys and none of us had seemed interested. And he finally got to have his dream fulfilled.
Today, David Foster is an ordained Episcopal priest with a ministry tailored for people struggling with sexual bondage. David believes his life is a message of God's faithfulness and redemption.
God says the generations of the unfaithful can go on for a few generations. The generations of the righteous are for 1,000 generations. No matter how perverse your life has been, you can be the first of a generation of thousands of generations of righteous if you'll just turn to God.
That is the coolest story of what God has done in David's life. You know, we're going to be back with more of this interview with David. Kyle Foster, Director of Mastering Life Ministries. So stay with us.
From Hollywood to Jerusalem, from prostitute to pastor, could you please tell me more how this happened in your life?
Well, you know, I was angry at God my whole life. I hated God because my father had been a pastor and I hated my father. So coming to the Lord was very difficult for me because I also had to admit that I had been wrong. And that was the hardest thing of all because I had so much pride in me. But God was working on me so gently and for so long, and I realized He loved me even though I had done all of these perverse things, and I could not escape that love. That's what I've been looking for my whole life.
What I want to know is, how did you know He loved you that much? Who communicated that to you?
Well, there in the Garden of Gethsemane, as we just saw in the story, the Lord actually spoke to me, and He pointed out that He's the one who proved His love for me. That my guru hadn't done that. My guru made me feel loved, but he hadn't actually demonstrated it through a self-sacrificing action. And when I realized this God who I hated loved me, it just blew all of my circuits, and I had to surrender. You got to surrender to something like that.
Well, absolutely, it's irresistible. But then what, though? You surrender, but you still have been cultivating these relationships and these attractions, so suddenly did He just come in and fix it?
Well, that's a very good question. I went to still didn't trust churches. But one day I walked down to this church and I said to myself, well, I'm going to go worship God in there, even though they're all hypocrites as far as I was concerned.
You're not bitter, right?
No, I wasn't bitter. I had no grudges. But so I walked into this church. Turned out it was full of born-again Christians. It was Hollywood Presbyterian Church. And I went to the pastor a few days later, and I thought, well, I'm just going to lay it out for him, so he'll either love me or kick me out right away.
Let's get this over with, right?
Let's get this over with. So I said to him, you know, I've been sleeping with 2 and 3 people a night for 10 years, and you're going to tell me to stop, and I'm here to tell you I can't just stop. And he looked at me and he goes, well, I'm not going to ask you to stop. And I remember thinking, what's the matter with you? You're a preacher. You're supposed to be asking me to stop. You must be one of them liberals I've been hearing about. But as it turned out, the message he was trying to communicate to me was, good, you know you can't stop. Let's let Jesus do it for you.
Wow.
And it was the most important lesson I could have ever learned. And I got to learn it right off the bat. And so I was fresh in my salvation experience. Nobody had gotten to me yet to tell me what God could not do. And I just believed Him. And so I said, okay, Jesus, if you will give me the power, I will stop this very day. And that was the last day. He set me free. He broke the power of drugs. I was a massive drug addict. He broke the power of alcoholism. And He broke the power of sexual addiction that had dominated my life for over 10 years.
Well, I'm just amazed at the fact this pastor who knew, I mean, I just love his heart in saying, you know, agreeing with you that you can't do it by yourself. You need the Lord. You need Jesus, and He's going to have to do it through you. And the fact that you knew that as well, not that you knew that, but that He communicated that to you. I
was naive enough to believe Him, and by golly, it was true. And the Lord's power came forth and set me free. Now, I still had a lot of brokenness. I still had a lot that needed to be healed. But what God set me free from was the power that those things had over me to control me and manipulate me.
Well, did your attractions immediately go away, or was this something that happened over time?
It took, I would say, a good 7 years, because I was in the lifestyle very deeply at very perverse levels. So it took a good 7 years before I could say, I feel like I'm healed. Of course, I'm still in the healing process, even 25 years later. But in terms of a basic healing package, so to speak, it took about 7 years. 7 years.
Yeah. Were you discouraged at all during that time? Were you wondering, is this ever going to happen? I mean, how did you hang on for 7 years?
There were moments of discouragement because I wanted God to zap me and just instantly make me heterosexual.
Don't we all want, just please free me now, immediately?
But if He had done that, I wouldn't have appreciated it. I would have gone back to the lifestyle probably, because I would have discounted what the gift would have been.
Well, and the character He needed to build through you.
Exactly. He builds character during those years where you have to rely on Him and go to Him moment by moment throughout the day for power and for grace.
Well, I want to know, was it just you and God, or were there other relationships that helped you along the way?
Well, this was back in 1980, and you just couldn't walk into the church and say, hey, I've been a male prostitute.
Well, you did that the first day, but...
Well, actually, you're right, I did, but most churches would kick you out on your ear back then. Now, it's much better these days. A lot of churches have learned a lot of grace over the 25 years, but I was afraid of getting kicked out of churches, so I didn't bring it up for at least 9 years.
So you weren't sharing what you were struggling with or what you were coming out of?
No, it was me and God, kneeling at my bed every night going, God, I'm being tempted by this. or I'm reading this in the Bible and I don't understand it, or I hate you, or I'm still mad at you for this, and I would just